Amara stood quietly in the corner of the playground, watching her classmates run around, their feet pounding against the gravel and grass. The sound of sneakers crunching on the ground echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the one thing she tried so hard to forget. Unlike her peers, Amara's feet were bare, pressed into the cool earth as she shifted her weight from side to side. She avoided eye contact, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground, hoping that no one would notice her. But they always did. The stares began the moment she walked into the schoolyard each morning. Some kids would glance down at her feet, whispering to one another, while others outright laughed. "Where are your shoes?" they'd ask mockingly, their voices filled with the cruelty only children could muster. Amara would force a smile and shrug her shoulders as if it didn't bother her. She'd brush past them, her heart heavy, but her face betraying none of the sadness she felt inside. Amara had become an expert at hiding her emotions. She'd perfected the art of acting like everything was fine, even when her chest tightened with anxiety and embarrassment. She knew better than to let anyone see her struggle. In the classroom, she would quickly slide into her seat, tucking her feet beneath her chair, making herself small and invisible. It worked for the most part. But not with Miss Carter. Miss Carter was different. She had a warmth about her, the kind that made you feel safe even when you didn't want to talk. She was in her mid-30s with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to look right through to your soul. She never pressed Amara to talk about her feet, but Amara could feel her teacher's eyes on her, filled with concern. Miss Carter was kind, patient, and observant, and something about Amara's bare feet bothered her deeply. For months, Miss Carter had watched Amara closely, her curiosity growing with each passing day. Why did this bright, eager girl, one of her best students, always come to school barefoot? It wasn't normal, and Miss Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. She had to know the truth, and so, after school one day, she made the decision to visit Amara's home. What she discovered there would change everything. Amara's life was simple, but far from easy. Her mornings began before the sun rose, in a tiny house that always felt too small for the 5 people living inside. The house was tucked away on the outskirts of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. It was modest at best, with chipped paint and a rusted roof that groaned every time it rained. Amara's room, if you could call it that, was a small corner of the house that she shared with her 2 younger brothers, Kwame and Malik. The 3 of them slept on thin mattresses laid on the floor, their blankets barely thick enough to keep out the cold night air. Every morning she would wake up to the sound of Malik's soft snoring and the occasional kick from Kwame, who always seemed to take up more space than his small body should have allowed. Slipping out of bed quietly, Amara would tiptoe around her brothers, careful not to wake them. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet, but she had learned to avoid the noisiest spots. She dressed quickly, pulling on the same faded dress she had worn the day before, and the day before that. It had been a gift from her aunt, passed down from a cousin who had outgrown it. The dress was too big for her, and the hem had been patched so many times that it barely looked like the original fabric. Still, Amara was proud of it. Her mother had sewn those patches with love and care, and that made it special. But the one thing Amara couldn't avoid was the empty space where her shoes should have been. She stared at the floor, willing the shoes to appear, but of course they never did. Her old pair had long since fallen apart, the soles completely worn through after months of trying to make them last. She remembered the day they finally gave out, how she had tried to hold them together with tape and hope, but nothing worked. That night, her mother had sighed heavily and promised they would get her new ones. But weeks had passed, and Amara knew the truth. They couldn't afford it. Her parents worked harder than anyone she knew. Her father spent long days at the factory, his hands calloused and rough from years of physical labor. He came home exhausted, often too tired to speak more than a few words, before collapsing into bed. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthier families, spending hours scrubbing floors and washing dishes. It was thankless work, and it barely paid enough to cover the bills. Amara understood their struggles. She never asked for much, knowing that every penny counted. She helped where she could, taking care of her brothers and doing chores around the house. Still, she couldn't help but wish for small things, like a new pair of shoes. But shoes were a luxury her family simply couldn't afford right now, not with all the other expenses piling up. Rent, groceries, utilities. There was always something that needed to be paid. So, each morning, Amara left the house barefoot, walking carefully along the dirt road that led to the school. The stones and gravel dug into her feet, but she had grown used to the discomfort. She walked with her head held high, refusing to let the pain show on her face. She didn't want anyone to feel sorry for her. School was her escape, a place where she could forget about her bare feet and the hardships at home. Amara loved learning. She loved the way words danced off the pages of her books, how numbers came together to form patterns that made sense in her mind. She loved answering questions in class, raising her hand eagerly whenever Miss Carter called for volunteers. But there was always that nagging fear in the back of her mind, that someone would notice her feet. She had become skilled at hiding them, tucking them under her chair or curling them beneath her desk. She moved quickly when walking around the classroom, keeping her eyes down to avoid the curious stares. In gym class, she made excuses to sit out of games that involved running, claiming her feet hurt or that she wasn't feeling well. Her classmates had grown used to it, for the most part. They stopped asking questions after a while, though she still caught the occasional glance in her direction. But Amara wasn't concerned about them. What worried her most was Miss Carter. She could feel her teacher's eyes on her sometimes, filled with concern and curiosity. Miss Carter never said anything outright, but Amara knew that she had noticed the missing shoes. Miss Carter was the kind of teacher who saw everything. She was patient and gentle, with a way of making her students feel safe. Amara liked her. No, she loved her. Miss Carter made learning fun, and she never made Amara feel ashamed of her circumstances. But even so, Amara couldn't help but worry. What if Miss Carter asked too many questions? What if she found out the truth? Life at home was a constant balancing act. Amara's parents did their best to shield their children from the full weight of their financial struggles, but Amara was old enough to understand what was happening. She overheard the late-night conversations, the whispered arguments about money, the long pauses filled with worry. Her father worked double shifts whenever he could, but it still wasn't enough. And her mother, well, her mother was a superhero in Amara's eyes, juggling work, household chores, and the emotional weight of keeping the family together. The small house they lived in wasn't much, but it was home. The roof leaked when it rained, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear the wind howling outside in the winter. They patched up the worst of the leaks with plastic tarps, and Amara's father had done his best to seal the cracks in the windows with duct tape. Still, the house was drafty, and the cold seemed to seep in no matter how many blankets they piled on. Amara's mother, Dolores, often stayed up late, her hands red and raw from scrubbing floors all day, sewing patches onto their clothes or preparing meals that could stretch for days. She rarely smiled anymore, the weight of their struggles pressing down on her like a heavy stone. But she loved her children fiercely, and she made sure they knew it. Every night, no matter how tired she was, she would tuck Amara and her brothers into bed, whispering words of love and encouragement. Amara adored her mother. She knew how hard Dolores worked, how much she sacrificed for their family. That was why Amara never complained. She didn't want to add to her mother's burdens. Instead, she focused on the things she could control: her schoolwork, her responsibilities at home, and most of all, her attitude. No matter how hard things got, she refused to let herself feel defeated. She had learned from her parents that resilience was the key to survival. But even the strongest walls crack sometimes. And for Amara, the cracks were beginning to show. Miss Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Amara was too quiet, too careful, and there was something about the way she avoided drawing attention to her feet that raised red flags. Determined to find out what was going on, Miss Carter decided she needed to pay a visit to Amara's home. It was something she rarely did, but in this case, she couldn't ignore the sense of urgency growing in her heart. After school on Friday, Miss Carter gathered her things, put on her coat, and drove to the outskirts of town. The roads became narrower and bumpier the further she went, the houses more spaced apart, until finally, she arrived at a small, weathered home tucked behind a line of trees. She sat in her car for a moment, watching the house. It looked old and tired, much like the stories Amara's eyes told in class when she thought no one was watching. Steeling her nerves, Miss Carter grabbed a basket she had brought with some baked goods, a small gesture of kindness, and walked up to the door. She hesitated briefly before knocking. The sound of children laughing and playing inside drifted through the thin walls, and she could hear someone moving around the kitchen. After a moment, the door creaked open. Amara's mother stood in the doorway, surprised but welcoming. Her hands were worn from years of hard work, her eyes tired but warm. She had the same quiet strength that Miss Carter saw in Amara every day. "Miss Carter," Amara's mother said, smiling politely, "this is a surprise." "I'm sorry to come by unannounced," Miss Carter replied, returning the smile. "I just wanted to stop by and check in on Amara. She's such a bright student, and I've been meaning to meet you." "Please, come in," Amara's mother said, stepping aside and motioning for Miss Carter to enter. The house was small, cozy, but cluttered with signs of a busy family. Shoes by the door, toys scattered across the floor, dishes piled in the sink. Miss Carter could see the struggle here. It wasn't just the lack of shoes. It was the weight of survival. She knew that in households like this, priorities were often set by necessity. Shoes came second to food on the table. New clothes were less important than keeping the electricity on. They sat together at the small kitchen table, and Miss Carter carefully brought up the subject of Amara's missing shoes. She didn't want to embarrass or shame the family, but she had to know if there was a way she could help. "I've noticed that Amara comes to school without shoes," Miss Carter said softly, her tone gentle and non-judgmental. "She never complains, but I've been concerned. Is there something we can do to help?" Amara's mother sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had suddenly become too much. She looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap, and for a moment, Miss Carter thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice filled with a quiet resignation. "It's been hard," she admitted. "We've been struggling to make ends meet for a while now. Amara's father works double shifts, and I clean houses, but it's still not enough. The bills keep coming, and there's always something we need to pay for. Shoes. Well, they just haven't been in the budget lately." Miss Carter nodded, understanding the situation all too well. She had seen families like this before, families who worked tirelessly but could never seem to get ahead. It broke her heart to think of Amara walking to school every day without shoes, quietly enduring the stares and whispers of her classmates. "She's never complained," Miss Carter said, her voice soft. "Amara is one of the most resilient children I've ever met." A tear slipped down Amara's mother's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "She's strong, like her father, but it's not fair. She shouldn't have to be this strong." That night, Miss Carter couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of Amara and her family, their quiet struggle playing over and over in her mind. She knew she had to do something more than just offering words of comfort. Amara deserved better. She deserved to walk into school each day with the same dignity and confidence as her classmates. She deserved to have shoes. Miss Carter stayed up late making plans. She decided to organize a fundraiser at the school, but she didn't want to single out Amara or make her feel ashamed. Instead, she framed it as a community-wide initiative to help families in need. The next morning, she went to the principal with her idea, and he wholeheartedly agreed. By Monday, flyers were sent home with the students, announcing a school-wide event, a bake sale, donation drive, and silent auction. All proceeds would go to support students who needed new clothes, shoes, and school supplies. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Parents volunteered to bake goods for the sale. Local businesses donated items for the auction, and teachers offered their time to help organize the event. Amara, unaware that she was the inspiration behind the fundraiser, noticed the excitement building around the event but didn't think much of it. She continued to go about her school days as usual, tucking her bare feet under her desk and avoiding the gaze of her classmates. She had no idea that her life was about to change. The day of the event arrived, and the school was buzzing with activity. Tables were set up in the gymnasium, lined with cakes, cookies, and pies, while the auction items were displayed in the hallway outside. Parents, students, and teachers flooded into the building, eager to contribute to the cause. Amara stood quietly at the edge of the room, watching the chows unfold around her. She didn't know why, but something about the event made her feel uneasy. There was a strange energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until Miss Carter called her to the front of the room that she realized what was happening. "Amara," Miss Carter said, her voice kind but firm, "we'd like to honor you today. You've been such a bright light in our school, and we all admire your strength and determination. This event is for you, for your family and others like you who have been facing tough times." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as all eyes turned toward her. She wanted to shrink into the floor, to disappear, but Miss Carter's warm smile kept her grounded. "Today, we've come together as a community to help you, Amara," Miss Carter continued. "You are not alone. We see you, and we want to support you." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as the crowd erupted into applause. She had never felt so seen, so understood. For so long, she had carried the weight of her family's struggles in silence. But now, standing in front of her entire school, she realized she didn't have to carry that burden alone. The fundraiser was a resounding success. Not only did they raise enough money to buy new shoes and clothes for Amara, but they also collected enough to help other families in similar situations. Amara's family received gift cards for groceries, school supplies, and even a new winter coat for each of her brothers. The outpouring of support from the community was overwhelming. For the first time In what felt like forever, Amara's family could breathe a little easier. Her father, who had been working double shifts, was able to cut back on his hours, and her mother was offered more stable work from one of the parents who had attended the event. The donations they received allowed them to catch up on bills, and for the first time in months, they had a little extra money to put aside for emergencies. But for Amara, the biggest change was in her heart. She no longer had to hide her feet under her desk or worry about what her classmates thought. She proudly wore her new shoes to school, and with each step she took, she felt lighter, freer. The burden of shame and embarrassment had been lifted, replaced with a sense of pride and belonging. In the months that followed, Amara continued to excel in school, but there was a newfound confidence in her step. She walked a little taller, smiled a little brighter, and participated more actively in class. Her teachers noticed the change, and so did her classmates. Amara's story had touched the hearts of everyone in the school, and she became a symbol of resilience and hope. Miss Carter, too, felt the impact of the fundraiser. She had always believed in the power of community, but seeing it in action was something else entirely. The way the school had come together to support Amara and her family was a reminder of what could happen when people chose kindness over indifference, when they decided to lift each other up instead of turning a blind eye to those in need. Amara's story is a testament to the power of compassion and community. Her bare feet, once a source of shame and embarrassment, became a rallying cry for kindness and generosity. Through the love and support of her teacher, her school, and her community, Amara was able to walk into a brighter future, one where she no longer had to hide, no longer had to carry the weight of her struggles alone. This story reminds us all that sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that have the greatest impact. A teacher's concern, a community's generosity, a pair of shoes. These things may seem small, but to someone like Amara, they can mean the world. In the end, it's not about what we give, but how we give. With love, with empathy, and with a desire to make someone else's life a little better. Amara's journey is far from over, but with each step she takes, she carries with her the knowledge that she is not alone. And that is perhaps the greatest gift of all.